So I thought we'd do something a little bit different this month since we're going to rank up some vampire comedies. Now, we've already done a different ranking of regular vampire movies, and one or two of the entries there could easily be considered a vampire comedy. Like Fright Night. But I see that more as a horror movie with a slight comedic edge than a straight up comedy film. Like, that one also had What We Do in the Shadows, which is very clearly a comedy, but it was there on that list, and we had that as one of the greatest vampire movies of all time, so I figured we'd let it stand on that as opposed to being here as well. And I went with these 12 movies, and I think this is one of those times that I'm sure that you'll tell me that I forgot this movie or that this movie belongs here, but I wanted to pick 12, and these are the 12 I went with. So, you know, I don't know, make your own show and make a list and rank up whatever ones you want, because I didn't forget any. I just chose these ones instead, and I sent this list out to my patrons, and they ranked them up from number 1 as their favorite down to their least favorite at dead last. Here were 12 points. So I had 32 entries, so the best possible score is 32 points, and the worst score would then be 384 points if everyone chose the same movie as their dead last. Something that has never happened in the history of the show. Never had a unanimous number 1 either. And one thing I want to say about this list, this was hard. A comedy is way more subjective than most things, and this was very, very apparent as these rankings are coming in. And I'll tell you now, this is the angriest that a dead last has ever made me. In Dead Last, this is a case where I guess comedy was less subjective than normal, because this was a bit of a blowout, and at no point in the entire process of receiving rankings was this ever not Dead Last. And with a strong 304 out of 384, we're looking at Lesbian Vampire Hunters. It was put in a dead last spot 12 times, so a little more than a third of the time. And the highest ranking that it got was second place, which it got twice. And this is the only film on the entire roster that no one put at number 1. Every other movie here got at least one first place spot, but not Lesbian Vampire Hunters. And I didn't have this in dead last, but I sure as hell had it close since I put it in 11th place. And I don't know what it is, but I just have an automatic dismissal of things that feature James Corden. I'm not sure if I can even put my finger on it, but you know, like when you're in a room and you see a spider and you just get that feeling, that, ooh, spider feeling. Like, that's what I get from James Corden. He just shows up and I shrink back. I mean, like that spider, it's not like he's done anything to me, and it's not like by nature he's a horrible person. I know very little about him, but I'm just naturally opposed to him, like he's the North Pole of a magnet and I'm south. And it's funny that my first experience with him was the British show Gavin and Stacey, and this is in a roundabout way the Gavin and Stacey movie, since both him and Matthew Horn were in it. And I can't be sure if I saw this movie before I saw that show. I'm not sure which of the two was my first ever introduction to him as an actor, but if it was this, let's just say that it didn't win me over. But there's two things about this one that I'm counting against it, besides James Corden. First of all, it very, very clearly wants to be Shaun of the Dead, but with vampires. Like you've got this sort of broken-hearted, meek and meager guy, and he's saddled with the heavy-set, overbearing, obnoxious sidekick, and the two of them are just thrust into the world of monsters and forced to fight back. But the problem is this: that meek guy isn't as likable as Simon Pegg, and James Corden is absolutely no Nick Frost. Secondly, it just doesn't seem to commit to its own premise. It calls itself Lesbian Vampire Killers, promising this sort of silly, over-the-top horror comedy, and then it just settles on, I don't know, somewhere in the middle. It kinda wants to take itself seriously and not go too far, but then occasionally tips things that way, and you're like, can you stay on that level, please? But it's too afraid to, and then pulls back. But you know what else gets at this dead last spot? It's not freaking funny. There's like one or two jokes that land here, and they're not even good jokes. They basically amounted to me breathing out my nose like this.
We're doomed. That ain't opening. In my defense, I only tried that side.
Our number 11 film dropped down quite a bit, and it's one that I'm pretty unhappy was this low. And it was lower at one point and looked like it might be some competition for the bottom spot, but then it started to get the love it deserves. But with 251 points, a full 50 points lower, we have Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter. This one did get 9 dead last spots, but also earned 2 first place spots as well. And I strongly disagree with this being in 11th place, since I put it in 5th, because I think this one is a ton of fun. And bear in mind, I have to grade this one on a curve, because it's so low budget, so cheaply made, and was shot on weekends over the course of a couple of years. And let's face it, the seams show, and its lack of resources have an impact on it, but it's still going above and beyond with what it had. But even though it does keep throwing some gold at you, like the talking dessert and the random inclusion of Santo, it does wear out its welcome a bit, and even at an hour and 24 minutes, it does start to feel a little overly long. It started to lose its promise as soon as Jesus loses his trademark look, cuts his hair and shaves and puts on modern clothing, and that's when it starts to seem a little tedious. But it throws out enough fun bits.
And on the 7th day, he rested.
That it's not like you're just staring at your watch waiting for it to end, since it's entertaining. And there's just this whole feeling of subversive cinema going on here, and it feels like part John Waters and part Troma. And it's weird because this film also features a focus on lesbians, but unlike lesbian vampire killers, it's not like it's a joke here. I mean, it sort of is, but as one of the patrons pointed out, it's the difference between a movie with lesbian vampires being written by a straight guy for a straight audience versus a movie written with a queer audience in mind, and it shows in the treatment. Now, I don't really think that this is a quality film, but given the budget, I enjoy it quite a bit, but I can admit that it's definitely not for everyone.
Hey everyone, here is your chance to do right. Step out of the tunnel and into the light.
Going down to number 10 now, and we had a much more slight drop. And here's where the competition started to get a touch fiercer. And this movie was a last-minute addition to the roster. It wasn't on my original list I sent out, but then I added it in. And with 238 points, we've got Transylvania 5000. It did get 2 dead last votes, which is a big drop considering our 11 and 12 movies took 21 of the 32 dead lasts all to themselves. So only 2 here, and it got 1 first place vote. And this one got 8th place from me, and come on, just look at that poster. Looking at that, it's very clear that they were like, hey, it's like Ghostbusters. It's a comedy film that features some characters going up against a supernatural, but they failed to capture any of that movie's vibe. And, oh my god, I made a joke in my video on the Vice Academy movies that a character says to another that she'll keep it warm for them, referring to her vagina. And I commented that the line also appeared in Samurai Cop. And I wasn't aware that this was an actual saying. But right here in Transylvania 5000, here you go.
Just go by. I'll keep it warm for you.
But there's 2 really great reasons to watch this one. First of all, the cast. Like, the comic chemistry between Jeff Goldblum and Ed Begley Jr. is fantastic, and the entire cast seems to be giving its all, including Michael Richards doing the whole Michael Richards thing. Like, all of his scenes make very little sense, and they're kind of doing the same thing over and over with it, but it's just so absurd that I at least got a chuckle out of it. And Carol Kane and John Byner basically steal the show, but I guess that's to be expected. Second of all, it has Geena Davis at the sheer height of Geena Davis-ness, and they put her in this outfit. For quite a while, whenever anyone was talking about this movie, I just referred to it as the Gina Davis vampire movie. And let's face it, this is a roster of vampire comedies, and this movie is very light on the vampire stuff. In fact, Gina's character isn't a real vampire, so technically there's some leeway to say that this shouldn't have been in there. But to that I counter, Gina Davis in this outfit. Although I have to point out that something about the ending that I find a little weird. The Hunchbacks are being ridiculed for their stature and called misfits and freaks and such, and they just give this big speech about how even with their deformity, they're still just people and don't deserve to be mocked and called monsters. And then they just stand right up. Like she literally tells the kids,
Stand up straight.
and he does. And everyone cheers like, hey, people with disabilities, just stop having those disabilities, I guess, and people will stop making fun of you and you will be celebrated, I guess. Let's take a look at number 9 now, and oh boy, was this one a rough one for me. And this was a little slighter drop down, and landing with 221 points. It's Dracula, Dead and Loving It. And people were very split on this one, let me tell you. But it only got 2 dead lasts and also 2 first place bids. And I was one of those 2 dead lasts, and holy crap, is this not funny at all. And in the complete opposite of what I was talking about with Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter, there's no way to not hold this to a higher standard. It's Mel Brooks, legendary comic filmmaker Mel freaking Brooks. And you've got him like making a sort of follow-up to Young Frankenstein, one of the funniest movies ever, following that same basic formula of telling the general story of the original and yet throwing a comic tone to it all. I know that it's not directly referred to as a follow-up to that one, but there's no way to not make comparisons between the two. Then they threw in Leslie Nielsen at the top of his game in there as well, so you look at this and you think, this is an easy A. But then they forgot a couple of things. First up, Young Frankenstein really tried to match the aesthetic of the original and duplicated the atmosphere and vibe, and yet this is happy to just be a standard comedy movie look. It doesn't have that same sort of reverence for the source material. And then, look, I love Nielsen as much as the next guy, but this type of comedy never really suited him. He was a standout in both Airplane and Naked Gun because those played off of his reputation as a dramatic actor, and having him read comic lines extremely straight is why he did so well there. A bunch of films he was in around this era felt like they all fell into the same exact trap of just trying to make him a goofy comic actor, and here he's just doing goofball comedy, and he does it well, but it's not playing to his strengths, so the jokes have to be stronger, and they are not stronger at all. In fact, to me, this is so staggeringly unfunny that it's shocking. So many of the jokes not only don't land, but they never even leave the plane. And honestly, that's the main reason why I put this in my dead last spot. I didn't laugh once, didn't even chuckle. I rolled my eyes a whole bunch though, and I really have to say, this has way less in common with Young Frankenstein than it does like Date Movie or Epic Movie or any one of those other really unfunny spoofs. This was our first really close call on this roster, but it won't be the last. But there was only 1 point separating our number 9 and number 8 movie. And sneaking past Dead and Loving It with 220 points, we now have another Dracula spoof, Love at First Bite. Now, this didn't get a single dead last vote, one of only 3 movies on the roster to not. But it did get 11th place once, and also managed to take 2 first place spots. And I must have changed my ranking on this one like 4 times because I just couldn't figure out how I felt about it, but I ended up settling it into 6th. And you want to talk a weird mishmash of things? Early on, we're already getting cameos by George Jefferson and adult film star Jack Baker. And I don't think many people know about this guy, but he started as a legitimate actor and things, and was on Happy Days and MASH, and was even in Kentucky Fried Movie and Tag: The Assassination Game. But then, around 1984, he started showing up in X-rated films, sometimes just as an onlooker or like an extra, but then as a performer. And he might be one of the first ever mainstream actors to cross over into the industry. But anyway, love at first bite. This ended up around the middle of my list because it's just kind of right in the middle of comedy. It has some pretty solid moments that are funny, but then there's other things that are big eye rolls. And then there's some casual racism here and there as well, like the poor black family that for some reason thinks that a bat is a black chicken. What? And I do enjoy the switch up of introducing Rosenberg, and at first you think that he's the sensible one and that he's going to have to make Cindy come around and not want to be with Dracula. But as the movie goes on, you see more and more he's kind of a jerk, and the Count is actually the better match. And I do have a semblance of nostalgia for this one since I watched it numerous times on HBO back in the day. But in contrast to some old comedies that I revisit, I still found some chuckles here. There's a vague resemblance to Transylvania 6-5000 in that the cast is all great and doing everything they can to sort of elevate this material that's perhaps beneath them. But the difference here is that they're somehow, against all odds, able to make it work somewhat. Plus, as a fan of the Jeffersons, I'll give a boost to any movie that's going to give me a shot of both George and Wheezy.
I command you to defy the laws of centrifugal force. Close your eye.
Yes, mister.
I said that this is where the competition was tough, and I meant it, since our number 7 movie only drops down 2 points to 218. So literally, one more ranking could have changed all 3 of these movies, really, but number 7 ended up being Suck. It was ranked in dead last once, but only once, and it was put in first place twice. So this is the first one I realized I had to rank low, even though I kind of like it, but I ended up putting it in 9th. And this movie's alright, but all the others I put higher just had more going for them, so I ended up putting it here, as opposed to the ones I put below it, which I generally don't like at all. But this one I did kind of like, and one of my favorite little bits in this is the occasional recreations of famous rock and roll albums. They do Abbey Road, which is probably the most obvious of them, but they also do Electric Warrior by T-Rex and Born in the USA and the Kids Are All Right. And it's a nice little touch. It was a fun little Easter egg hunt while you're watching the film. But I almost wish that there was a bit more rock and roll in the overall story. Like, based on like that and the appearances of famous rockers, you'd think that there would be this rebellious rock aesthetic to the whole thing, but it's more content to be a standard sort of tale instead. One minor drawback is writer-director Rob Stefaniuk's casting of himself as the lead character, and he's not bad, like he's not a bad actor or anything, but he's just lacking the charm that I think we'd need for this role. I pointed this out before in other films, but the whole character of the jerky dude that you're also supposed to really like is very hard to pull off, and not a lot of actors succeed. Most of the time, they just end up coming off as a jerk, and that's the case here. Another issue is that the whole vampirism as drug addict metaphor is so blatant and on the nose that it comes off as clunky. If you're looking to make a movie about drug addiction, then do that. If you're looking to make a movie about vampirism and have it be a metaphor for that drug addiction, like, you've got to be more subtle than this, or else the audience is going to be sitting there going, yeah, we get it, which is what I was doing through 80% of this. It's pretty likable overall, though. Like, Jessica Paré is particularly great as the vampiric Jennifer, and there's enough cool cameos here and there to make it a nice ride. But here's my biggest issue. It's a rock and roll movie, and it features rock and roll music, and Alice Cooper, and Iggy Pop, and Henry Rollins, and then they play the songs, and they're like, not great. They're all like, yeah, we're rock and roll and bringing the metal, and then they're only slightly better than Ezra.
guys are acting funny.
Moving on now to the top half of the list, and things are still pretty close in terms of points since our number 6 movie only dropped down 9 points, but it's one that I certainly wanted to be higher, since with 209 points, we're looking at Rockula! This was ranked in dead last 3 times, and one of those was Professor Victor, who just hates musicals, so how dare you? But it was also put in first place once. And I have some very irrational love of this one, so I put this all the way up in second place because I have no hate for musicals. And you know, what a weird movie this is. You have Dean Cameron, and he's like kind of on a roll after Summer School and Bad Dreams, and he's just tossed into this thing, but then you have Tony Basil just hissing away. And Thomas Dolby in an acting role, which is something I thought I'd never see. And then Susan Tyrrell, and Bo Damn Diddley, and even Tony Cox tossed in there as well. I mean, it's not really a cast that makes you say, wow, I can't believe they got all those people, but it sure as hell makes you say, wow, this is a strange set of folks to throw together in a movie. And for the most part, this feels like a silly, lightweight 80s comedy. But then it gets to the musical numbers, and they're just so bizarre. They're songs by someone who seems to have never heard music before.
You don't walk. Glides. With bat wings and bangs. He's a bloodthirsty dude.
And Dean Cameron knows music. He's in a band, and he used to do this live karaoke thing, and I actually got to sing with him a couple of times. And here's a story for you. The second time I went to go see his live karaoke band, the Corys, I went with Mikey, and he gets up on stage to do his song with the band, and he leans over to Dean and says, "Hey man, I loved you in Rockula," and got a laugh from him. But when their tune was done, Cameron was just like, "That was Mikey, one of 3 people who's seen Rockula." But Dean, now there's at least 32. And then this movie's called Rockula, but his second song is a rap number, Rapula, and it's just, I have no idea what the thought process was. Plus, it's like he decides to create a band and just recruits the random people at a bar he's at, including the bartender, and they all, I guess, just know how to make music? But it's super charming, and although it's never really laugh out loud funny, it's not really like trying to be either. It's not like the movie yells, "I'm telling jokes" at you. And I love that a portion of the movie is him trying to keep the fact that he's a vampire away from Mona, but meanwhile he's in a band called Rockula talking about him being a vampire, and literally has a song where he says,
He's the DJ, I'm the vampire. I'm the vampire.
But him being a vampire isn't even essential to the plot. He doesn't even do many vampire kind of things outside of the silly bat stuff. But that whole aspect of the story is secondary to him being an immortal and dealing with his love's reincarnation loop. And honestly, they could have just made him like an immortal person or whatever, and the storyline would be the same. But he's the vampire. I mean, he was very adamant about telling us so.
I haven't seen her for days.
And Ralph, I haven't seen him either.
I'm back!
Getting down to the wire now, and our number 5 movie again dropped down some, but not really a drastic dip in points, since with 183 points, we have the arguably a comedy, Vampire's Kiss. This is one of the 3 that never took a dead last spot, but it did get 3 11th place rankings, but it also took that top spot 4 times, the most of any movie so far. And damn, I'm just so torn with this movie. I really struggled with where to place this more than any other entry on this list, but ended up slotting it in 3rd. I had it in 1st at one point. But anyway, the deal with this movie is that if you take a look at any discussion about this movie, pretty much every single bit of it is completely centered around Nick Cage's performance. And let me tell you, it's something to be seen. At first you're like, is he doing some sort of accent? Then you realize it's not any sort of accent, but a whole affectation, and it's not a bit he's doing. This is the character.
There
Very good. You know your alphabet.
I never misspelled anything! Not once, not one time!
But here's the thing I need to preface this whole opinion with. I hate it. I think he goes too far, and this whole quirky take on the character serves as a detriment to me. And you, as the viewer, sort of lose focus on the movie itself, and his acting choices become the only thing that you can pay attention to. And if you don't believe me, refer to me saying that all discussion of this movie tends to be about his performance, and there's very little discussion of the film itself, which is a damn shame, because that being said, it's a good movie. It's American Psycho before American Psycho, before the novel even. It's this weird little adventure into madness and vampirism. And I know, much like Transylvania 6-5000, this could certainly be called out as not actually being a vampire movie, since it's very clear that aspect is simply in Peter's head. But it's called Vampire's Kiss and features a bunch of scenes of vampish stuff, and I figured was worth including. But there's another thing, and I'm going back to Cage's performance because, as I said, it's all anyone talks about with this movie. But without his kooky acting choices, this isn't a comedy. It's actually a very dark drama with hints of humor. If another actor came in and played that role straight, this wouldn't be called a comedy film whatsoever. It would be in the drama section. And I find that whole aspect kind of fascinating. And now I want to know. I want to know if they intended that or had to roll with it once Cage came in with his whole take on things. Like, the writer was Joseph Minion, and he did it to deal with the end of a particularly toxic relationship and was in a dark place. And the screenplay was called grim and horrifying. So I really wonder if he looks at Cage saying,
"It's too late! Too late! Too late! Too late!"
and is like, they killed my baby.
My girlfriend broke up with me. I'm a vampire. Kill me. Kill me.
This was another battle that was very close here, since it's just 1 point away, and the final ranking switched with 182 points, and it's Once Bitten. It did get a single dead last vote, but it also got 3 first place ones as well. And I had this one right where it landed, since I put it in 4th place myself, and the 80s, when it seemed like the only thing that any guy had to worry about at all was getting laid. Like, it was the entire focus of anyone's being. It's like every other comedy from this era had a main character guy who wasn't getting action, and the entire plot was for him to achieve his goal, to get action. But what's funny is that no one in this movie looked like a high school kid. I know that was a thing, but it's way more noticeable here than usual. Hell, Karen Copens was almost 30. Not that you could tell, really, though. And a lot has been said about this one having a way before fame Jim Carrey in it. And honestly, you can kind of see what he would become later on, but I kind of prefer this version, not trying too hard by making overly exaggerated faces over and over again. It's kind of weird, though, because when you're watching really any 80s movie, the chances that you're going to encounter some racism and homophobia is pretty high. But this one goes in pretty hard with the gay panic. But you know, this movie makes vampirism seem not so bad. The Countess doesn't seem very evil, grants people immortality, doesn't appear to kill anyone, and hands out the sexiness regularly. I'm not too sure that I would be mad about this whole vampirism deal. And I love Lauren Hutton. She's awesome, and she's great in this role. But they wrote it with Elvira in mind. Not like Elvira, the character in the movie, but Cassandra Peterson as the Countess. And I can't imagine how different that would have been. But as a movie, it's all right. The humor works at times and doesn't at others, but everyone seems to be giving it their all. It's not really covering much in the way of new ground because, like I said, every other movie of the 80s involved a guy trying to get laid, and this one does that, but just with a vampire. There's enough standout moments to push it up the roster a bit, though. Most notably the dance-off, where Carrie plays his leg like a guitar, and my crush on Coppins flourished. But here's a fun game. Every time a vampire hisses, take a shot. Haha, no, don't do that. You'll die. Here we go, top 3 time, and let me tell you, when I first wrote out these options, I didn't really know where anything was gonna land, but I never, ever in my wildest dreams predicted this top 3. Ever. And coming in third with 174 points, it's Bloodsucking Bastards. I know, I'm just as surprised as you are, but it did get 1 dead last vote, but it also got 5 first place hits, the most of any movie so far. And I like this one, but clearly not as much as some others, since I had it in 7th. But I like this cast so much. There's just a lot of nice performances from people that I like. Fran Kranz is always charming, and Pedro Pascal is in this like he is in everything, and he's having a great time while doing it. And did you know that Fran is really buff, and when he's in movies like this or Cabin in the Woods, they have to give him baggy shirts so that you can't tell that this guy is ripped because it would go against his nerdy everyman image? The odd man out in this one for me is Joey Kern as the slackery sort of Brody from Clerk's character, because like I said earlier with Suck, I think the dude is meant to be so obnoxious but also oh so lovable, but I just thought he was a dick. Kern is good though, and I like him fine as an actor, but maybe just not this part. But there's a couple of problems with this movie keeping me from ranking it any higher. Number 1 is that with a couple of exceptions, most of the characters are pretty flat and tend to blend into one another. Like everyone has that same sort of shtick of, oh, these guys hate their job and they're kind of fun, but also awful to each other sometimes, although they start to differentiate more as the movie goes on. But the bigger problem is that you feel like it's all been covered before. A lot of the whole Office cubicle humor has been done to death by this point in both Office Space and The Office. And granted, it predated some of the other Office-based horror movies. It's not really throwing out a ton of fresh insight. But on the plus side, it's still very watchable and fun, and you like everyone that you're watching, so it's a good time, but just ends up being forgettable. The big plus that it has going for it, though, is that the more it goes on, the better it gets. The energy in the final 20 minutes of this one is exactly what I was looking for, but it just takes too long to get there. Like, maybe if it had captured that feel for the preceding hour and 10, then I would have put it up higher, but I just couldn't. Although from the looks of it, most of you disagree with me on that front, since it's ended up in 3rd place.
My teeth are like swords. I am vengeance, and I am immortal!
Only 2 movies left, and this got really close. There was one movie that started strong in 1st place and stayed there for the entire time, but then this movie slowly started creeping up there, almost catching it. There was a time that this movie was in 6th place overall, and it just kept knocking movies out of the way, and on the final night, for a moment, it jumped up into the top spot, but the last couple of rankings pushed it back down to 2nd, because at 150 points, it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This was the final film to get no dead last votes, but it did get 1 11th place spot, but also took 1st place 6 times, the most of any movie on here, even the number 1 film. And this was a rough one for me, and I'm sure I'm going to get some flack for this, but I'm just dumbfounded this was almost number 1, since I was actively rooting against this one, and I have it in 10th. And look, there's just no way to watch this movie without comparing it to the TV show. I'm a rather big fan of the series, and I think that it's one of my favorite shows of all time, and I can't separate the two. And everything that the TV show nails, this one fails at. But at least the cast is just so insanely stacked. It's like Dazed and Confused levels of recognizable faces that would be much bigger much later on. But the problem is that unlike the show, in which Buffy is more or less a foil to the supporting cast to bounce off of, here, she's the entire focus. There's so much more hanging on Kristy Swanson here than there ever was on Sarah Michelle Gellar, since this is much more her movie as opposed to an ensemble. And the fact of the matter is that she just can't do it. She can't carry this film. She doesn't seem to get the character. And I guess like Buffy herself is supposed to be early on, she comes off as totally vapid. But there's supposed to be more to this character than that. And near the end, when she's supposed to have learned and grown and stopped being that spoiled brat, Swanson just seems stuck in that mode and it doesn't work. It also is too silly for what they seem to be going with. The script itself just isn't that funny. It feels like a script to a fairly serious film with some jokes, but then no one is playing it that way, and it doesn't seem to be directed that way. It feels like they're trying to make a comedy, but for that, it's just not funny enough. Donald Sutherland seems to understand the assignment, but no one else really does, and that makes Paul Reubens and Rutger Hauer stand out even more. They're the highlights of the film, for sure, but that's because they're doing a comedy, and their parts seem tailored to a comedy. Nothing else in the script, and none of the other characters are. So it fails. And this may be rougher than it needs to be because, again, I love the show. I think it's fantastic. And it managed to get the right feeling, which just makes it all the more apparent that this movie does not.
You're gonna wish you died. Ooh, ah, ow, ooh, ooh, ah, ah, ah,
And that leaves us with one film remaining to take that #1 spot, although just barely, I guess, because with 146 points, all that's left is My Best Friend's a Vampire. Even though it's the #1 movie, it's still got one dead last vote and only 4 first place spots, 2 less than Buffy, but it had so many other high-ranking votes it cleared that top spot early on. And I was one of those, since this was my #1, and I admit this is precisely what I think of when I think of vampire comedy. It's humorous enough to be a comedy film, but also does a good job incorporating that vamp story, as well as giving us a nice overall message. And what's really wild here is just how similar the setup of this one is to Once Bitten. They both have a high school student who's having issues with love, and one night has an encounter with a sexy older vampire woman who turns him, making him gradually cooler and more desirable to ladies. And what's weird is that I've only seen this once or twice before, whereas I saw that one a ton, so I don't have a strong sense of nostalgia for this film. But between the two, it's the better film, and the one that I enjoy watching more. Sure, it's not like it's miles better, because it's still just a simple, fun vampire tale that feels a bit familiar, but then it differentiates itself by doing something different. It has something to say. The thing that really makes this one stand out is the way that it is very clearly and obviously a metaphor on coming to terms with homosexuality, while at the same time desperately trying to convince its audience that that's not what it's doing. Oh, but it is, and it's pretty blatant, which is why I think that they had to throw in that extra note of the parents literally thinking he's gay and feeling reassured when he's not, because it was the 80s and talking about coming out was a very unfashionable thing to do. But as opposed to a lot of the films listed here, this doesn't exactly have a top-notch cast list ripe with comedy legends. Sure, it had David Warner, Renee, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, let you do it in the comments, and Kathy freaking Bates, but it's not like those guys are known for the ha-has. But everyone's doing a great job here and making this fun little poignant story that also happens to be kind of fluffy and oh so 80s.
This blood's for you.
So there you have it, 12 vampire comedies all ranked up, and let's take a look at this roster. And yeah, I do not agree with most of this. I'm good with Lesbian Vampire Hunters being dead last though. But a lot of what's on here is wildly different than what I would like, particularly Buffy the Vampire Slayer in second place, but I guess I'm the crazy one with that. But hey, comedy is subjective, and wildly so. So let me know what you would put where. And you know, keep in mind, you could have affected these rankings greatly, because as you saw, one single ranking could have changed quite a bit of these numbers. And you can become one of the patrons that do these rankings every single month by going to patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can subscribe for like $1 a month, whatever you want, really, and you get a list of movies every month. And if you would have ranked some of these movies differently, this whole list would have been different, with just one more person out there voting. So go do that. But yeah, let me know where you would have ranked them down below in the comments. I'd love to hear what people think of this. And if you enjoyed this video, of course, hit the like button, hit subscribe if you enjoy the channel, and hit the bell for notifications, and go to that Patreon page. But otherwise, keep on coming back and watching these movies, and I'll see you very, very shortly for another great video. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.